The morning my husband handed me a check for $240,000, he actually smiled. Not the smile I fell in love with 12 years ago, the crooked, boyish one he'd flash across the hospital cafeteria when he thought I wasn't looking. This was different, tight, satisfied. The kind of smile a man wears when he believes he's being generous while getting exactly what he wants. 7 years, he said, sliding the check across the kitchen island like it was a business transaction. Like it was a tip. I think that's more than fair, Nora. 7 years of marriage. $240,000. I picked up the check. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I set it back down, very carefully, and walked upstairs to our bathroom, turned on the shower, and sat down on the cold tile floor fully clothed, because my legs had simply stopped working. I should tell you what happened the night before, because that's where this story really begins. My husband's name is Ethan. Ethan Cole. He's a civil engineer, 41 years old, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who gets called a good guy at dinner parties, because he remembers to ask about people's kids. We met when I was 26 and doing my residency at Toronto General. He was visiting his sister on the 7th floor. He asked me for directions to the elevator bank, and then, somehow, 40 minutes later, we were still talking in the hallway about nothing in particular, and I missed an entire lunch break and didn't care at all. We got married in Niagara-on-the-Lake in October. It rained. We didn't care about that either. For the first 4 years, we were good, better than good. We bought a house in Oakville, a Victorian semi that needed everything. And we did most of it ourselves on weekends, Ethan patching drywall while I painted trim, both of us covered in dust and laughing at something stupid on the radio. Those years felt real. I still believe they were real. Then I got the position at Stonebridge Capital. I need to explain this properly, because people always assume. They hear finance and they picture something cold and sharp. And maybe that's fair. But when I took the position as Director of Strategic Investments at Stonebridge, I wasn't chasing money. I was following something I'd been building quietly for years. A methodology for impact investing in Canadian healthcare infrastructure that my mentor, a woman named Dr. Frances Holt, had been developing since before I finished my MBA. She brought me in to lead it. I was 31. I was terrified and thrilled in equal measure. Ethan said he was proud of me. He said it again when I made VP at 34. He stopped saying it sometime around 36. Though I didn't notice right away because by then we were both so busy that silence had started to feel like its own kind of normal. I noticed other things though. Eventually. The way his phone would turn face down on the table when it lit up. The Tuesday nights he started working late that became every Tuesday, then Thursday too. The new gym membership, which I wouldn't have thought anything of, except that Ethan had always hated the gym and would have sooner run outside in a February ice storm than set foot on a treadmill. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself this for 8 months. Then one Thursday in March, I came home from a conference in Montreal a day early because my flight got moved up, and I found a woman's jacket hanging on our coat rack. A cream-colored blazer, very pretty, not mine. Ethan wasn't home. He was, I later learned, still at whatever restaurant they'd been to. He'd thought I wasn't coming back until Friday. I sat in our living room for 4 hours. I didn't turn the lights on. I just sat there in the dark on the sofa we'd picked out together at an estate sale in Burlington, and I waited. He came in at 11:15, saw me, froze. I asked him who the jacket belonged to. He told me. Her name was Sasha. She was 32. She worked at his firm. It had been going on for 7 months. He stood in the doorway in his coat, not even fully inside the house, and he told me this with a kind of exhausted relief, like he'd been waiting to be caught. Like my finding out was a favor he'd been waiting for me to do him. I think, he said, that we've grown apart. I looked at him for a very long time, and then I said, in a voice I barely recognized as my own, "Get out of my house." He went to stay at his brother's place in Mississauga, and the next morning, he sent a message through his lawyer. A lawyer he'd apparently already retained, which told me everything about how long he'd been planning this. And by that afternoon, his lawyer had called my office. I didn't have a personal lawyer yet. I was still in the phase where I thought this might be fixable or at least navigable without a legal war. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. 3 days later, Ethan came to the house, not to talk, to measure. He walked through our home with a clipboard, an actual clipboard, and made notes about which furniture he wanted, which artwork, the espresso machine we'd bought in Italy on our 10th anniversary. He was methodical about it, efficient. He'd become a stranger wearing my husband's face, and the stranger was very organized. At the end of the walkthrough, he handed me the check. "I've spoken with a valuation consultant," he said. "Given my contributions to the mortgage and the renovations, this represents your fair equity share. I think we can keep this simple." I looked at the check. I looked at him. I thought about the fact that my salary at Stonebridge was $430,000 a year, that I had been paying 60% of our mortgage for the last 3 years while he was restructuring his investments, and that our house in Oakville had just been assessed at $2.1 million, $240,000. I set the check back on the island and walked upstairs. That's where I was, sitting on the bathroom tile in my work clothes, with cold water running down the drain when my phone rang. It was my father. My fa's name's Gordon Webb. He's 74 years old, and for the first 36 years of my life, I believed he was a retired civil servant who'd worked his way up through the Ontario Ministry of Infrastructure, collected a decent pension, and spent his retirement fishing on Georgian Bay. He drove a used Subaru. He wore the same canvas jacket for 11 years. He made his own yogurt. He called it frugality. He said he'd grown up with nothing and never forgot it. What I didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that my father was the primary silent investor behind a real estate and infrastructure development trust called Lakeshore Meridian Holdings, which controlled a portfolio valued at approximately $3.4 billion across Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia. He had structured his involvement through a series of holding companies and numbered corporations in the late 1980s. His name appeared nowhere public. He had a small team of lawyers and a financial advisor he'd worked with for 30 years who handled everything discreetly. He lived simply and quietly because he genuinely preferred it, not because he had to. He had told almost no one. He had told me once, when I was 17, in a conversation I had partially believed and partially filed away as one of my father's more abstract speeches about stewardship and responsibility. He'd said, "When the time comes, you'll understand what I've been building. I need you to be ready for it." I'd nodded and thought he meant his pension. He called that evening while I was still on the bathroom floor. I answered because I always answer my father. "I heard about Ethan," he said. I hadn't told him yet. "How?" "Your Aunt Frances called me." "Of course. Doc Frances Holt, my mentor at Stonebridge. She'd been my father's close friend for 30 years. I had never connected those dots. "Dad, I'm okay." "I know you are," he said. "Nora, I need to tell you something. I've been waiting for the right moment, and I've been wrong to wait this long. Can you come to the cottage this weekend?" I drove up to Georgian Bay on Saturday morning. My father made tea. He put a folder on the table. It took about 3 hours to explain, and even then, I sat with it for the rest of the evening before I believed it completely. Lakeshore Meridian Holdings, the trust, the portfolio, the succession structure he'd built, quietly, with my name at the center of it, the sole named beneficiary and designated successor CEO. $3.4 billion. "You've been working in infrastructure investment for 10 years, my father said. You understand this world better than I did at your age. I'm not giving you a gift, Nora. I'm handing you a responsibility. There's a difference." I sat there at the kitchen table looking at the lake through the window and thinking about Ethan's clipboard and his lawyer and his valuation consultant. And I felt something settle in my chest that I don't have a precise word for. Not revenge, not satisfaction. Something quieter than both. A kind of clarity. "Okay," I said to my father. "Tell me everything." The next 6 weeks were the most intense of my life, and I have worked 80-hour weeks in hospital corridors and closed mergers in 48-hour sprints, so that statement carries some weight. I took a leave of absence from Stonebridge. My father's legal team, led by a sharp, white-haired woman from Bay Street named Lydia Crane, began walking me through the transition. I signed documents, I sat in meetings, I read the entire structure of Lakeshore Meridian Holdings from the first partnership agreements in 1987 to the most recent quarterly reports. I also hired a divorce lawyer. Her name was Patricia. She was 60 years old. She wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she was absolutely ruthless in the most polite possible way. I liked her immediately. My husband had no idea any of this was happening. As far as Ethan knew, I was on leave from work because of stress. He'd heard this through his brother, who'd heard it from a mutual friend. Ethan, to his credit, or perhaps his guilt, hadn't pushed. His lawyer, however, was pushing hard. The position they were taking was that because I had been the primary income earner for the last 3 years, I had a lower claim on the marital assets because the imbalance was already factored into the equity agreement. This was legally creative in the way that a house of cards is structurally creative. Patricia demolished it with quiet, cheerful precision. What Ethan and his lawyer didn't know yet was that the house in Oakville, our house, the Victorian semi we'd renovated together on weekends, was sitting on land that bordered 2 parcels Lakeshore Meridian had purchased in 2019 for a mixed-use development corridor. That development had recently been approved. The land values in that neighborhood had just been reassessed, and our house was no longer worth $2.1 million. It was worth 3.7. Patricia sent this information to Ethan's lawyer on a Wednesday afternoon. I know the exact moment he told Ethan, because Ethan called me directly for the first time since March. Nora. His voice sounded strange, thinned out. Can we talk? Talk, I said. The reassessment. The lawyer is saying the numbers have changed significantly. I want to make sure we're handling this fairly. You already told me what you thought was fair, I said. $240,000. Silence. Ethan, I said, very calmly, let the lawyers handle it. Here is the thing about people who underestimate you. They always reveal themselves in the small moments. Not in the dramatic confrontations, not in the lawyers' offices, in the small moments. There was a moment, about a month into the legal process, when Ethan's brother Callum ran into my sister at a farmer's market in Oakville. Callum, who had always been perfectly pleasant to my face, apparently said to my sister that it was a shame Nora fell apart like this, and that Ethan deserves to move on and be happy. My sister, to her eternal credit, said nothing. She just took a photo of the kale she was buying and sent it to me with the caption, "You good?" I was good. I was, in fact, better than I had been in years. The Lakeshore Meridian transition was consuming and difficult and fascinating in equal measure. My father joined the calls for the first few weeks and then gradually stepped back. And I realized he wasn't supervising me. He was watching me, and he was satisfied with what he saw. There was a project in Hamilton, a mixed-income housing development on the edge of a brownfield site, partnered with a local indigenous housing authority, that had stalled for 2 years under the previous management. I got it moving again inside 3 weeks. The project lead sent my father a note. My father forwarded it to me without comment, which was the highest form of praise he knew how to give. Sasha, as it turned out, was not entirely unintelligent. She had, about 2 months after everything came to light, apparently begun to sense that the man she'd built a future with was maybe not quite what he had presented himself to be. She and Ethan had moved into an apartment together in Liberty Village, a nice apartment, the kind of place that costs $4,000 a month and makes you feel sophisticated until you realize you're spending $4,000 a month. By June, she had moved back in with her roommate. I didn't feel triumphant about this. I want to be clear about that. I felt genuinely nothing much about Sasha at all. She was 32 and she'd made a choice, and she would live with it. That was between her and herself. What I did feel something about was the day the final divorce settlement was signed. Ethan got half of his own retirement savings and his car. He got the espresso machine, because I'd told Patricia not to fight that particular battle. He got the artwork he'd picked out with the clipboard, most of which I had never liked anyway. I got the house, not because I particularly needed it. The house was worth $3.7 million on an updated assessment. And that number wasn't finished climbing. I kept it because I had stripped every piece of trim in that house with my own hands, and I had painted every room. And on one specific Saturday in November 4 years ago, I had stood in the half-finished kitchen with a glass of terrible wine and laughed until I cried at something Ethan said that I've already forgotten, and I had been happy. I kept the house because some things are yours, and you don't owe anyone an explanation for knowing it. The part of this story that people always find the hardest to believe is what happened in September. Ethan's firm had put in a bid for a major infrastructure contract. The expansion of a commuter transit corridor in the Greater Toronto Area, public-private partnership, roughly $600 million over 5 years. It was the biggest project his company had ever pursued. He had told his brother it would set them up for a decade. Lakeshore Meridian was one of 3 consortium partners attached to the selection committee's evaluation framework. I want to be very precise about what I did and didn't do here, because this matters to me. I did not use my position to block Ethan's bid. I would not have done that. What I did was recuse myself entirely from any evaluation that involved his firm. I disclosed the relationship to Lydia and to the other committee members, and removed myself from those discussions completely. The evaluation went forward without me. Ethan's firm did not get the contract. They came in second. And the winning bid was from a consortium that had been building their case for this project for 3 years, which his firm simply had not matched NEN's depth of preparation. That decision had nothing to do with me. What happened next, though, did involve me, at least indirectly. One of Ethan's partners, a man named Douglas, who I'd met several times at firm events, reached out to the consortium through proper channels to discuss a potential subcontracting arrangement. A reasonable move. The consortium's project coordinator went to Lydia to ask whether there were any conflict of interest concerns given my history with Ethan. Lydia consulted me. I said there were no professional concerns on my end, and the decision was theirs entirely. The consortium brought Douglas's team in as a subcontractor, but in the course of those discussions, Douglas had apparently said something to the consortium's lead about Ethan. Something dismissive, something that suggested a division in the firm's partnership. And that information got back through the industry grapevine. The way things always do in infrastructure circles. And by October, there was a quiet but real fracture in Ethan's firm that he had not seen coming. He called me once more in November. "Nora," he said, and this time the thinness in his voice was different. Not surprise. Something closer to a man who has just begun slowly to understand the full dimensions of a room he walked into a long time ago. "Ethan, I don't." He started again. "I didn't know. About your father, about any of it. I know you didn't," I said. "I want you to know that it wouldn't have." He stopped again. I let the silence sit there for a moment. "Goodbye, Ethan," I said, not unkindly, not coldly, just finally. My father had a small gathering at the cottage in October. 7 or 8 people, a few from the Lakeshore team, his oldest friends. He made a fire, and someone brought wine, and late in the evening, when most people had drifted inside, my father and I sat on the dock in our coats looking at the black water. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Actually, yeah." "The Hamilton Project," he said. Frances called me again. "Dad," she called it transformational. "It's a start." He was quiet for a while, then, "Your mother would have been proud of you. She was always proud of you. But this is different." I didn't say anything. There are things that don't need a response. The fire crackled through the screen door. Somewhere out on the bay, a loon called once, and then went quiet, and the dark water held everything perfectly still. I thought about the check on the kitchen island. $240,000 and a tight, satisfied smile. I thought about the bathroom tile and the cold and the shower running uselessly overhead. I thought about Frances Holt telling me, 11 years ago on my first week at Stonebridge. "The people who underestimate you are doing you a favor. Let them." I hadn't understood what she meant then. I do now. There is a version of this story where I am the woman who almost lost everything. Where the check is the ending. Where the tile floor is the ending. Where a man's clipboard and his lawyer's letterhead get to write the final line. That's not this story. This is the story of what I was already building, quietly, in the years when no one was watching. This is the story of what it looks like when that building is finally finished, and you open the door, and you walk through it. My heels on the dock were probably ruining the wood. I didn't care at all.